Grüß Gott, hallo, ich bin Billy Berger und zusammen wollen wir in den nächsten paar Wochen über die Kunst des Übersetzens nachdenken. G'day, Yapolingina. My name is Billy Badger and I'm coming to you today from Nipaluna, Hobart, the lands of the Palawa people here in Lutruwita, Tasmania. But I'm just one of the lecturers for this unit who will be taking you on this exploration of the everyday art of translation. In the course of the next 13 weeks or so, you'll be meeting a number of my colleagues in global cultures and languages and beyond who, along with me, have designed this unit and will be helping us to teach and think more deeply about translation. And this week, as a kind of an introduction to the unit, we're going to be asking the question, do we even really need translation? Well, today I want to start off in a really general way by looking at the title of our unit. It's Mixed Messages, the Everyday Art of Translation. And I want to give you a brief overview of some of the topics and the ideas that we'll be considering in this unit. So clearly, this is a unit about translation, but it's also a unit where you'll be able to have a bit of a go at translation yourself, even if you only know the one language. And as you'll have noticed, the unit title suggests a number of things. It suggests translation is something that happens a lot, every day, in fact. It's something that affects all of us. I'm suggesting also that while there's a definite skill to translation, it's just as much an art. But I'm also suggesting that in the process of translation, there is always the opportunity for the messages that we are trying to convey to get mixed up, to be misunderstood, to cause confusion, even conflict. So some of the main arguments in this unit are these. All communication is translation. The message I'm sending is always received in a different form to the original. Translation is a complex art. It's not a simple process of substituting one word for another. And all translation is a compromise. There will be situations where the message doesn't get through or can't be transmitted exactly as intended. Now, it would perhaps, of course, make sense to spend some time now looking at what we actually mean by translation, but it's a big question, and it's one that we're going to take our time answering. So for now, I want to consider the relatively straightforward idea of translation between languages and ask the question, do we even need it? And it's a good question, I think, but maybe we really don't even need translation between languages much anymore. We live, after all, in an increasingly globalized society where you might argue English is a kind of global language. And not only that, but the number of distinct languages is decreasing quite rapidly. Although there are currently, well, have a guess. How many distinct languages do you think there are in the world? This is pop quiz number 1. What do you reckon? 50? 100? 200? In fact, there are as many as 7,000 distinct languages in the world, which is, I guess, probably a whole lot more than any of us really would have guessed. And as many as half of these 7,000 languages are expected to be extinct by the end of this century. In fact, it's estimated that one language dies out every 14 days. And for an example close to home, if we look at the indigenous languages of Australia, of which a great many have been recorded, many of these are listed as extinct or critically endangered. Others are variously listed as dormant, vulnerable, or severely endangered. And closer to home, the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre tells us there were, at least before European settlement, anywhere between 8 and 16 separate languages that could have been spoken in Tasmania. And today, Palawakani is the only Aboriginal language in Lutruwita, Tasmania. But none of today's Aborigines grew up speaking it as a first language. And it's a language that has had to be rescued, returned, reconstructed, approximated. And it relies to some extent on English grammar. We're perhaps also aware of the increased use of English and English vocabulary in many languages. In fact, it's such a big deal that there are special words for this in many languages. In France, it's franglais. There's Chinglish in China, and German people often refer to Denglish. So surely, if this process continues, is it not reasonable to conclude that English will soon be the only language left? Either way, you might want to argue, for example, that most of us here in Australia have grown up with the English language. Aren't we a pretty monolingual bunch of people? Well, English is, of course, the language that I'm speaking right now, no doubt with, I guess, some kind of Australian English accent, even though I myself wasn't born in Australia and don't speak English at home. As a monolingual Australian, how often do we need or encounter translation? After all, if push comes to shove, we've got Google Translate, haven't we? Doesn't that do all of the hard lifting for us? Well, we'll be looking at the question of machine translation in an upcoming lecture. But if you look a bit more closely at the population of Australia, more than half of us, in fact, 51.5% of all Australians were, according to the most recent census, either born overseas or have at least one parent who was born overseas. And while, of course, some of these people themselves come from English-speaking countries, quite a large proportion of Australians, 22% in fact, don't speak English at home. And that's an increase compared to the numbers in the 2016 census. And while we're thinking about it, a lot of countries have an official language. Many countries have more than one official language and some other regional languages as well as a number of minority languages. All right, so here's another quick question in my translation pop quiz. What's the official language of Australia? Well, I guess we'd say English, wouldn't we? Well, no, actually, because Australia doesn't have an official language. And if we look closely at the Australian population, we'll see Australia is actually a culturally and linguistically diverse country that has changed in its cultural orientation over the years of European occupation. Various waves of migration have influenced Australia and continue to do so. Migrants from the United Kingdom have made up the largest group since Federation back in 1901. But from the 1950s until the 1980s, Italians were the second biggest group. And from the early 1990s, Chinese migrants were among the top 10 for the first time, with numbers steadily increasing. Well, what about now? Well, communities and populations from Nepal, India, Pakistan, Iraq, and the Philippines are the ones that are continuing to grow the most. So it's clear, I think, that in fact, not everyone does speak English at home. Other than English, the most common languages spoken at home are Mandarin, Arabic, Vietnamese, and Cantonese, and Punjabi is hot on their heels. Well, what about here in Tasmania? Let's turn our attention to the situation right here in Tasmania. If we zoom into Hobart, which is where I am at the moment, we can see that the number of people born in different countries varies actually quite a bit from suburb to suburb. Further north, the community from Nepal increases to it's around 6% of the population. There's even a Nepalese pub in South Hobart, and in early November, a Nepalese festival has joined the growing number of cultural festivals in Tasmania. And if we move down south to Sandy Bay, the Chinese community sits at around 10%. And of course, the commercial landscape of the city is changing rapidly in response to this changing demographic. Where there might once have been European delicatessens, we're now much more likely to come across an Asian eatery or an Asian grocer. And there must be a need for translation in Australia currently, because the Department of Home Affairs currently offers a translating and interpreting service for more languages that I'm willing to count at the moment. Australia is clearly a multicultural country, and Tasmania is becoming increasingly multicultural. So for some people, admittedly perhaps not the majority, translation of this sort between languages is something that arguably needs to happen on a fairly regular basis. But there are other important sorts of translation that happen on a regular basis, and we'll be thinking about many of these in the coming weeks. Let's just have a look at some of them right now. There are Auslan interpreters who regularly appear at press conferences.
Mikey Webb has dispensed crucial information at hundreds of media conferences to the deaf community.
They're finally getting that information firsthand. They're finally getting it when everyone else gets it, rather than having to wait to be told.
So I think we're familiar with these. Translating or interpreting, really, what's being said into a sign language that can be understood by the hearing impaired. Talking to other people, we continuously translate people's facial expressions and body language, trying to deduce subtext and meaning and intention. But in a neurodiverse world, not everyone gets the same message. How much of what we think we are saying gets lost in translation?
I really, really, really do not get facial expressions. And I don't do facial expressions either. I do, like my face does things, but they don't match.
Translators are also hard at work translating books into different languages to make them accessible to people who wouldn't fully or maybe easily understand the original language. But is it the same book? Have compromises been made?
Well, that's a very good question. And in some ways, I'm not sure that I'm the right person to fully answer that, because I'm not fluent in all of or in any of the languages indeed that my books have been translated into. Having said that, I've spoken with quite a few of my translators of my books. I've been very lucky, fortunate to have met a few of my translators. And while I know they can't change big plot things, they can't change anything that's content of the book, the way that they simply phrase and style the language does create massive differences in text and does do things to mood and atmosphere. And for instance, I can talk a little bit about the German edition of my novel, Stolen. So I had a couple of really interesting chats with my translator about this book. First of all, the title, that does not mean stolen. Ich wünschte, ich könnte dich hassen. I wish I could hate you. So even in the title change, there's a really big difference in the kind of book that they're advertising and selling to their readers, although that may or may not have been a translator's decision. They are the same book and they aren't the same book. So I think that translators are enormously skillful, because not only do they have to be able to translate the work, but they also need to translate the style of the work as well.
And the same goes, I guess, for film subtitles, useful for those of us wanting to watch the latest Korean miniseries on Netflix.
지금 이 자리에 계신 여러분들은 모두 감당할 수 없는 빚을 지고 삶의 벼랑 끝에 서 계십니다.
Is that really what they are saying? Or is it just a neat, close enough kind of summary that happens to fit on the screen? And then there are news reports coming out of the Ukraine, Russia, China, or any other country for that matter, that needs to be translated for the English-speaking world so that we know what's going on.
Of course, energy workers, utility workers, rescuers and everyone involved are working at their maximum.
For that matter, news reports coming out of the English-speaking world equally need to be translated into Russian, Chinese, Japanese, or of course any other language. And are these word-for-word translations?
Like a memory question. It's like you'll go person, woman, man, camera, TV. 10 minutes, 15, 20 minutes later, they say, remember the first question? Not the first, but the 10th question? Give us that again. Can you do that again? And you go person.
Is this even possible? But there are other kinds of translations that we're going to be looking at. Scientific ideas and findings, or I guess any complex economic or political idea that would just be way over the heads of the normal citizen, need to be translated into a simpler language that can be easily communicated and understood and achieves the desired result. As an example, Lisa Gershwin has built a career researching these tiny but deadly jellyfish called
Irukandji jellyfish. So small, it's almost invisible, but within its tail, a toxin that can kill.
I realized that I needed to have a better approach. If people were going to actually listen to me and indeed be safer, I needed to have the backing and the approval of the tourism industry, the science industry, the government, the
Yeah.
And mostly people. People needed to want to hear what I had to say so that I could give them the beach and safety too, right? And that's hard to do.
It's the same information, I suppose,
Same
essentially.
information, wrapped up a little bit differently.
And isn't that also what we mean by euphemisms or weasel words? These are really just translations that occur within a language that have the effect of concealing the reality. Why do some people find it useful to call dingoes wild dogs? Or what is a tender age shelter? Why did Donald Trump use this phrase?
Donald Trump admits that images of children in chain-link lockups look bad politically. That may be about to go from bad to worse. A new report reveals that
possibly to translate the reality into something more widely acceptable than the prison for migrant children at the US-Mexican border that he was talking about when he used
with
the
our
term.
first look inside what U.S. government officials are calling, euphemistically, tender age shelters.
So when we choose our words, we're translating our ideas. We're giving them shape and meaning. And these words, depending on which ones we choose, can create power imbalances, inequity, privilege, or simply a fairer society. So I want to leave you now with the thought that words do matter. They shape the way we think and the way we think about people. When we translate our ideas into words, the words can shape perceptions and reality. According to researchers at Stanford University, even a relatively harmless sentence such as, "Girls are as good as boys at maths," can subtly perpetuate sexist stereotypes. It implies that being good at maths is more common or natural for boys than girls. So language can play a big role in how we and others perceive the world, and linguists work to discover what words and phrases can influence us unknowingly. Well, okay, that's it for this week. Hopefully I've given you something to think about. And when we meet again, we'll be taking a more in-depth look at the question, what is translation? And before I go, let me remind you that there are some other resources to read and watch before our tutorials start next week. So do please make sure you've worked through these before our tutorial. Well, we'll be starting to think just a bit more deeply about some of these issues related to translation, and maybe even have a go at some translation ourselves. And yes, even if you only speak the one language. So that's it for today. Have a great week. See you next time. Ich wünsche Ihnen eine schöne Woche. Bis zum nächsten Mal. Tschüss.